Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Library of Congress. Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Brent Iacobucci. I'm the acting director of the Kluge Center, and we're glad you can join us this evening. And I will just note that there is extra food, so feel free to grab seconds if you would like. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supports the Library of Congress's chairs in U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relations. The chairs lead policy-relevant research, programming, and bipartisan legislative discussion on U.S. relations with China and Russia. The focus on the present state of relations and the public policy challenges that will face legislators in the future. Mary Lovely started in January as our chair in U.S.-China relations. She's also the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and a professor of economics at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. She combines teaching and research on international trade and investment and on the Chinese economy. We thank Mary for assembling an excellent panel this evening. Willie Shi is the Robert and Jane Cizik Professor of Management Practice in Business Administration at Harvard Business School. His expertise is manufacturing and product development. Paul Triolo is Senior Vice President for China and Technology Policy Lead at Albright Stonebridge Group. He's a recognized expert in global technology policy. The speakers' full bios are included in the program, so you can read those at your leisure. Again, we're glad to have you here tonight, and we hope you'll return. Before you leave, I encourage you to fill out our survey, which provides us with valuable feedback on ways to maintain and improve the quality of our programs. I would also ask everyone to please silence your phones and other electronic devices. Last but not least, we are recording the panelists' remarks, but once we move to the Q&A, the recording will stop and all the questions will be off the record. And with that, I'll pass things over to Mary.
Thank you all for coming tonight. We all know securing American supply chains is a vital imperative, especially in light of the ongoing Russia. Opening remarks. I've arranged a program so that each of us will offer views on different aspects of this issue, and I think that will lead to a lot of things to talk about during Q&A to follow. I will focus on trade policy, trying to draw some lessons from the recent U.S. tariff increases, especially those levied during the U.S.-China trade war. Dr. Shi will provide an overview of how trade policy influences manufacturing supply chains and offer his views on how the U.S. can best respond to the challenges. Mr. Triolo will provide a deep dive into semiconductor supply chains and discuss how trade policy fits into a broad array of policy tools. I'm looking forward to this. Resilient supply chains must balance efficiency and security. Unfortunately, oftentimes these days we hear that efficiency and costs are no longer important. It's about resilience. But of course we know that that's not true. We're looking for a balance between these two. And so that leads to the question of how can U.S. trade policy contribute to making U.S. supply chains resilient while keeping American companies competitive? Since we're here in the Library of Congress, I must note that a 2020 Congressional Research Service report provides a useful overview of challenges the U.S. faces from current configurations of global supply chains, which encompass more than 2/3 of all world trade. New questions are raised about the risks poised for the United States from these global supply chains, and the CRS highlights a variety of policy levers that are available to Congress for reducing these risks, including tariff policies, trade agreements, and export controls. We'll touch on all of these policy tools during tonight's discussion. Let me start with a focus on import policies. It's useful to remember that 60% of U.S. imports are intermediate goods and capital goods, not consumer goods. In other words, imports are an essential part of U.S. domestic production. Without imported intermediates and capital goods, U.S. producers would be far less competitive on both domestic and foreign markets. Clearly, these production and trade patterns reflect the movement of labor-intensive activities to low-cost locations over the past 30 years. Recent events, however, have raised the importance of resilience in supply chains, not just cost minimization. Secure supply chains provide insurance against unforeseen risk, whether they come from Mother Nature or from Mr. Putin. It's about cost and availability and access in extraordinary times, not one or the other. The insurance motive implies that we should look to diversify supply sources, in other words, not reshore everything, while keeping efficiency in mind. We cannot friendshore only to high-cost countries and expect to compete with other advanced economies who continue to buy from lower-wage locations, whether in Eastern Europe, ASEAN, or Mexico. Tariffs are a blunt tool for achieving the supply diversity we need for resilience. They raise prices for both imported and domestic source goods. They push buyers toward domestic suppliers, if any exist, but they do not otherwise reduce risk and may in fact increase risk due to mono-sourcing. Tariffs on intermediates and capital goods raise the cost of U.S.-produced final goods. They do not raise the cost of foreign-made final goods. In this way, they clearly handicap American producers, even if they reduce competition for some American suppliers. Research using detailed customs data finds that firms that faced the 2018-2019 tariff increases on their imports accounted for 84% of all U.S. exports and 65% of manufacturing employment. For all affected firms, the implied cost is $900 per worker in new duties per year. The decline in exports from new tariffs is equivalent to an ad valorem tariff on U.S. exports of almost 2% for the typical product and almost 4% for products that face heavier than average tariff exposure. In other words, it's like our trading partners had erected tariff barriers against us. It's very difficult to see these tariffs as anything other than an own goal for U.S. exporters. Tariffs also penalize firms that are unable to adjust, such as small and medium companies, or those without the resources to fund exclusion requests. According to U.S. Census data, small and medium firms account for 40% of all firm imports from China. So it's not a stretch to say that these smaller companies are differentially handicapped by tariffs. Finally, as we've seen repeatedly over the last 4 years, tariffs invite retaliation that hurt U.S. exporters in another way. But even if tariffs hurt exporters, one may think that they're useful in reducing overall reliance on, say, authoritarian countries. What can we learn from the U.S.-China trade war about how unilateral tariffs alter supply chains? The China tariffs were levied on about 2/3 of all U.S. imports from China. The idea, I think, was that the U.S. could force China to stop stealing technology by turning American buyers away from Chinese exports. In other words, we would use our market power to show them that this was not the right thing to do. These tariffs were generally not targeted toward sectors where we believed theft had occurred. The value of trade that we wanted to place tariffs on, President Trump at the time wanted to place tariffs on, was so vast that, of course, it incorporated a very wide share of U.S. imports. U.S. imports of newly taxed Chinese goods did fall substantially, as was desired. But they were replaced by imports from other sources, mainly, such as imports from Vietnam, Mexico, and Thailand. One important lesson here is that supply chains are complex and comparative advantage is a powerful force in the world. Tools used to alter one piece of the supply chain often have unintended consequences. A good example is that the trade war tariffs on U.S. apparel imports led to Chinese offshoring of production to Vietnam. Literally unscrew the machines, put them on the boat, go across, install them, get the workers. Chinese producers were not removed from the supply chain, but higher costs were absorbed by American consumers. While some Chinese practices did change as a result of the trade war, many did not. And we are left with tariffs that are largely untargeted. They hit shoes as well as computer parts. Today, in 2022, we might look at the tariffs afresh and ask, with supply resilience in mind, are any of these goods really national security risks or national economic security risks? What should we do about them? My analysis shows that of almost 14,000 products that we buy from China, we levy tariffs on 12,500 of them. How many of these products qualify as high-tech goods, products or processes where we need to protect American technology? Using the Chinese definition of high-tech, only 7% of these products are high-tech goods. Using a much broader definition that includes every activity that's related to a high-tech sector, like pharma, no matter what the activity is, only about 25% of the products can be considered technology-based. In other words, 75% of the products that we are taxing cannot in any way, shape, or form be classified as high-tech. The cost of untargeted policies is very high. To date, the CPB has collected $132 billion in revenue from the China tariffs. As study after study shows, these tariffs are paid by U.S. buyers. They're not borne by Chinese exporters. For manufacturers using Chinese inputs, these taxes reduce their ability to compete against non-American companies, as seen in estimates I gave earlier of reduced U.S. exports. Unless we think that at least our tariffs have reduced global reliance on China, a goal we might share, I note that China's share of global exports rose in 2019, 2020, and 2021. Lesson: supply chains are complex. U.S. firms are hurt by tariffs. Untargeted tariffs are costly without seemingly offsetting strategic gains. While tariffs are blunt, unpredictable, and costly instruments, other trade policy tools could be used to enhance supply chain resilience and U.S. economic security. The process clearly starts, as the U.S. is doing now, with the identification of supply vulnerabilities. Where are we overly reliant on one country or region, considering both natural and geopolitical risks? In which industries is it realistic to expect that the U.S. can develop a viable domestic industry? Where can we increase reliance on friends and allies for alternative supplies? Once we identify alternative sources, how can we create new linkages between these sources and American buyers? Commercial agreements, I dare to say trade agreements or trade plus agreements, can be used to lower the cost of doing business in new locations, not only by lowering tariffs. The U.S. already has very low tariffs, and so do many of our trading partners, but by reducing uncertainty for businesses about border controls, domestic regulations such as data localization, and the movement of key employees, as well as dispute settlement. Uncertainty is a powerful factor in the creation of supply chains, which rely to a large extent on direct investments by private firms in new plants and new relationships. I don't think I need to point out to this audience that the TPP was designed to perform this function in the Asia-Pacific region. New analysis from the U.S. Census finds that U.S. importers typically rely on only one or two main foreign suppliers. So we need not only to assure that U.S. companies have the ability, are able to source from multiple locations, but that firms can find and engage with these new foreign partners. Ensuring this capacity will require helping firms identify new suppliers and working all across government to make sure that U.S. infrastructure, regulations, and customs facilitation support supplier diversification. In closing, I will say that the recent U.S. experiment with tariffs, what we call in the economics literature the so-called return to protectionism, provides useful lessons for today's impetus to build more diversified and resilient supply chains. Tariffs impose a cost on U.S. buyers, and they reduce U.S. export competitiveness. Supply chains are complex, and tariffs affect them in complex and unpredictable ways. And lastly, tariff policy can be used to support, rather than penalize, private sector decisions by reducing the cost and uncertainty of finding and creating new cross-country supplies linkages. Thanks, and with that opening, I'm going to turn it over now to Willie Shih, who will talk to us about manufacturing supply chains. Thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Mary, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for your comments. I should mention that I came to the Harvard Business School in 2007, and prior to that, I spent 28 years in industry doing product development, manufacturing all over the world. And actually, a very formative period for me was the period from especially right after 9/11, 2001, when we really saw this offshoring movement and movement of production to China, right? So I had a factory in China. I had manufacturing in Japan. I had manufacturing in the US, Mexico, and Europe. And so it was really a very formative period. I often describe to students this. I said, business is conducted on a playing field. It's like a soccer pitch where there's a set of rules, and then you have fair competition means using the same set of rules for everybody to apply. One of the things I think there's been a lot more discussion of recently is the competition between liberal democracies and autocracies, where we might use free market rules, and some of the autocracies and some of the countries that are under discussion now might use a different set of rules. Now, historically, I would argue we have granted exceptions because we thought either those countries were just learning the rules or we had some geopolitical objective. So when we talk about IP theft and we talk about some of these non-market practices that we see in China, well, before that we saw it in Japan, and then we saw it in Taiwan and Korea and a lot of the other Asian tigers. And in fact, if you go back to the 1870s, we practiced some of those things in the US vis-a-vis the UK as well. So sometimes we think a country is headed in a free market direction, or we have some geopolitical objectives, so we can trade those political ends for the economic means, right? I would argue Korea and Taiwan and Japan, of course, have been notable successes in that regard. I would argue Nixon's opening towards China. I have to admit that until Xi Jinping took over, I thought, well, okay, they are coming in a direction that we want. Okay, now what we see is the world is changing very fast, and I would argue it's like, let's look at where we are. I would argue today we are in a situation where global multinationals and countries are far more dependent on China and other autocracies than we realize. Okay, and Mary mentioned that. You can see it in the trade statistics. Okay, we had record imports over every month. It seems like there's more record imports. It's because a lot of our manufacturers don't have any alternatives to go to other places for a whole range of products. So we talk about some of these dependencies. I think it's much more significant than we realize. Offshoring has led, for the US in particular, to a loss of many capabilities, okay, and is far more than I would argue most people realize. In fact, I warned about this in a paper in 2009, and that 2009 paper really came out of my observations in the early 2000s. I remember being in an optical components factory in Shenzhen around 2002 saying, there will come a day when the US Department of Defense wonders how we lost this battle. Okay, and that was around 2002, and it was already evident then, right? The fact of the matter is, if you look at China, this is not a recent phenomenon, right? This is something that took them 35 years to where they got to. A lot of people don't remember there was the 863 program. You probably know the 863 program, right? The 863 program was named 863 because it was 1986 in March, where 4 scholars went to the Chinese government and said, if we want to be a modern economy, we have to be good at these things, okay? And I remember looking at the list back in the 1990s, and I said, that's a good list, right? It was actually very visioning. Okay, so I don't need to rehash where we are, right? But one of the things that China did extraordinarily well in the first decade of the 21st century is localized supply chains. It used to not be the case, right? It used to be you had Hong Kong as a nexus where you'd buy components from all over the world in Hong Kong because there were no duties on goods moving in and out. I remember standing in factories in Shenzhen. It's like, okay, send me 500,000 kits of parts to make DVD players today, right? I'd send the kits of parts in, some of the DVD players, send them back to Hong Kong, or do some value add and have them go back and forth. Okay, and what China did that was really very well thought through was to make the economic case, harnessing their market size, as well as just the economics of moving goods around, to localize all the supply chains. And that's what really happened in the first decade of the 21st century. It used to be China would import many, many more components from Japan, from Korea, from the US, from Western Europe. Okay, but then with the right incentives, they got everybody to move in. Okay, so what do we do now? Okay, my thinking is we really need to have a realistic assessment of where we are and recognition that we can't do everything ourselves. I don't think it's widely appreciated how interdependent we are. And by the way, we're not willing to do everything ourselves in this country. Right? So that's another issue. And I think from a trade policy standpoint, I think I agree with Mary that we should be thinking about North America or North America and Europe, plus maybe a few friends across the Asia-Pacific region as a bloc. Certainly, if you look at North America, US, Mexico, and Canada, I have a huge market, I have innovation, I have resources, I have low-cost labor, I have all of these different pieces. Okay, now, the other thing which may be a little counterintuitive to people is I think we need to strengthen where we are strong and then identify the critical few that we think from an innovation standpoint we really need to do well, recognizing that we can't do everything ourselves. Okay, people ask me what's on that list. I say biotechnology, first of all. Right, and I often give the example of, I was down here once talking to some people about, people in Washington say, oh, Massachusetts, you guys have everything you need in biotechnology. We don't need to give you any help. And it's like, no, actually that's wrong. What you want to do is you want to strengthen it so that everybody in the world who wants to be in biotech, well, look at mRNA vaccines, right? You look at CAR T cell therapies, look at, you name it, you have to play in that area. When Novartis, the Swiss pharma giant, moved their R&D headquarters from Basel, Switzerland, to Cambridge, Massachusetts, I mean, the Swiss, I'm sure, were beside themselves. Okay, but that's what we as a country can potentially do. So I say biotech. I worry a lot about aerospace, by the way. I think we should be worrying about aerospace right now. Boeing has a lot of self-inflicted wounds, okay, but they have lost the lead in commercial aerospace. That's a disaster. We can talk about that in the Q&A. I think we should focus. So much I hear about these days is focusing on the supply side of the problem. I think we need to focus on the demand side as well. Stable demand is one of the most powerful tools we have for encouraging manufacturing in the US, but we rarely use it as a tool. We can leave more of that for the Q&A as well. So further to strengthening where we are strong, we need to encourage exports, encourage others to trade with us, make it easier, not harder, okay? I've been talking to people in the Port of Los Angeles. It's like our biggest export is air, right? It used to be waste paper and recycled materials until China said they didn't want those anymore. I mean, it's such a huge advantage in terms of the cost differential of exporting. Why aren't we exporting more? Along the same lines, I really worry about a lot of talk around weaponizing trade or restricting exports of key tools or goods, thinking that somebody else isn't going to develop a substitute. All we have to do is look what happened to the global positioning system when we think about that. When we put restrictions on GPS, of course, then the Russians had to have their own, the Chinese had to have their own, Europeans had to have their own, not even the British have to have their own. Okay, and we've really lost the ability to lead in that. I would argue that on trade, we need to tone down the rhetoric and get our own house in order first. We have a lot of trouble reconciling some of these conflicting goals. Until the pandemic, I would remind everybody that much of the low inflation that we have enjoyed has been a product of this globalization and the ability to use labor arbitrage and bring in inexpensive exports. When you offshore from a high-cost country to a low-cost country, say from the US to China, what pays for that is the savings in product costs. What pays for the new factory, what pays for training the workers, what pays for setting up the supply chain is your reduced product costs. So that type of offshoring works when you go from a high-cost country to a low-cost country. Math doesn't work when you go the other way, right? You have to have some other tools, mainly improve productivity, if you're going to bring some of these things back. I think we need to think strategically about this issue long-term, well beyond the next election cycle. The other thing I think is very important is if we're going to build more local strength in manufacturing, domestic strength in manufacturing, we need to change the mindset of our young people. Nobody wants to go into manufacturing anymore, right? I see that as an educator, right? Every year it gets worse. How many engineers, people who want to make products and services are in the pipeline, right? Rather than just encouraging people who want to be rent-seeking. Okay, so that's a big mindset problem as well. So those are some thoughts, and I'll turn it over to Paul, and I'm sure we'll have a healthy discussion about this.
Thank you. Thank you. And I remember traipsing around a factory in Shandong that was recycling old U.S. newspapers. I picked up the San Francisco Examiner. I can still remember that. But how things have changed since then. All these points that Willie and Mary are making are great. I think I'll try to focus on some of the really high-tech sectors that are part of this discussion around securing and making American supply chains more resilient. We at Albright Stonebridge represent many companies that are at the center of some of these issues because, for example, they have large manufacturing facilities in China that are part of global supply chains. So when I hear the word, the global supply chain, for example, I kind of smile because I think as Mary highlighted, the supply chains are very complicated. Each sector has its own set of issues. Nobody, I think, realized that Ukraine produces 40% of the world's neon that is used in lasers to do lithography to make semiconductors, right? And so that's become a huge issue. How do you deal with that if you lose 40% of your neon supply, along with a lot of other minerals, critical minerals that Russia and Ukraine supply, for example. So the supply chain issue, I think, is really critical. And as Mary mentioned, there's sort of, there's a trade policy and supply chain resilience are sort of the topic of tonight's discussion, but it really is a much broader issue, of course. And Mary mentioned also export controls and industrial policy. So we're sort of in the era where we've got this sort of export control system, for example, which was designed for weapons of mass destruction that is now being used to try to solve for great power competition or maintaining U.S. technology dominance. And so that has some implications we can talk about. And then also, of course, we had the U.S. getting into industrial policy, which is a really tough thing, particularly for sectors like semiconductors, where it is a very global industry, and the question of, is sort of where should the U.S. play in this? How should the U.S. encourage allies to help make these complicated semiconductor supply chains more resilient? And we've seen over the last couple of years some of these things come together. For example, export controls and supply chains around semiconductors. So, for example, the issue of U.S. export controls on Huawei is a good example, which we ended up doing a lot of work on. I was the Huawei analyst at CIA for 10 years, so I've forgotten a lot about Huawei. But obviously a very important company, and when the U.S. put export controls on Huawei in 2019 and then extended the foreign direct product rule to Huawei in 2020, just as the pandemic was hitting and other pieces of the supply chain in the semiconductor industry were under pressure. If you talk to some people in the industry, that actually contributed as much as 15 to 20% to the global semiconductor supply chain shortage, which led, of course, to job losses in the U.S. In the auto industry. So that was obviously an unintended consequence of an export control policy, but that shows how complicated these supply chains are and how U.S. policy choices can have unintended consequences. So what we've had, of course, is 30 to 40 years of supply chain optimization in China and Asia more broadly, too. Because I think in the semiconductor industry, it's really not as much about China as it is about Taiwan, one could argue, depending on what part of the semiconductor supply chain you're talking about. So it really is a question, when we start talking about supply chain resilience in the semiconductor space, you really have to start dragging in Taiwan pretty quickly, and then maybe Japan and South Korea and other places, because Asia as a whole is a critical player in those supply chains. And then, of course, you also have the trade issue is important because you have the digital piece of trade is really now arguably the most critical part of trade agreements, as we see with things like CPTPP, USMCA, and DEPA. And of course, China has applied to join CPTPP, a very interesting position here. So the trade and supply chain and export controls and industrial policy all come together here. So let me touch on a couple issues around U.S.-China strategy elements that impinge on this. And then I'll ask, are we using the right tools? And then I'll give you some views on how to right-size the challenges. So, of course, as a result of the concern around supply chains, particularly in semiconductors, we've had this big emphasis on domestic innovation and onshoring. And then others, of course, have called it friendshoring. So we're looking at onshoring, in particular, advanced semiconductor manufacturing. So we have, of course, the CHIPS Act, which, even as we speak, is in conference along with the US ICA and the Competes Act to try to finally fund that to the tune of $52 billion. That's a really interesting piece. But again, that's interesting because it's not really so much about China as it is about reducing the dependence on Taiwan because of the fear of a potential Chinese move against Taiwan, of course. So China is involved there. But that's a really complicated issue because as the CHIPS Act is being passed, other countries like Japan, South Korea, are also, and India, of course, is the latest to jump in, are also stepping up efforts to subsidize their semiconductor industry and onshore advanced manufacturing. A key element of this that gets overlooked a lot is the R&D part of this, and I know that in some of the portions of the Competes Act and the CHIPS Act, there are or the US ICA, there's a lot of money for R&D in the US because, again, if you're going to be onshoring advanced semiconductor manufacturing, you better have these other pieces of the puzzle here that include really intense R&D efforts. And of course, Europe is also doing this and has very good R&D efforts in the semiconductor industry. And then, of course, you also have the semiconductor issue being part of a lot of other efforts around supply chains, the supply chain executive order that the Biden administration put out last year, which also includes EV batteries and rare earths. And those are all also really very much related to one another. EV batteries are used in automobiles, which use a lot of semiconductors. Rare earths are used in magnets. The Tesla Model 3 that I drive has 200 magnets in it. And just to give you a sense of the dependence on China here, China produces 200,000 tons of magnets per year, of which 60,000 tons are rare earth magnets, which are critical for lots of things, including green energy and wind turbines and EV batteries and motors. And by 2025, China will go to 400,000 tons of production. The US produces 20,000 tons and will go to 25,000 tons in 2025. So if you sort of extrapolate that out and the administration's green targets and green goals here, it's hard to see how China is the dependence on China for something just as seemingly simple as magnets is not going to become a huge issue. So all of these issues are also part of the U.S. policy is to reach out to allies in Europe and Asia as part of tech alliance building. We do a lot of work on that. A lot of our companies are interested in helping with some of these supply chain issues. So the EU Trade and Technology Council, for example, which will be meeting again in May, and the Quad are all looking at issues around supply chains for things like semiconductors and things like rare earths and EV batteries. So these are really important issues that are being tackled. The problem is how to really determine metrics in terms of success, in terms of reducing dependence on China or on Taiwan or making supply chains more resilient. It's a really difficult problem to figure out a metric for that. And then the other question that I want to raise here, and we can talk more about in the questions, is: are we using the right tools for all of these things? So, for example, if in the export control arena, we're using these, as I noted, these older provisions, which are really designed for weapons of mass destruction. There's been some talk about using the things like the TTC to come up with a sort of fifth export control regime, which would build on the existing systems, but would be designed for dual-use technologies. So we're really being very targeted in the way we use export controls to avoid some of these collateral issues that I mentioned. And certainly in the case of Russia-Ukraine, the TTC provided a venue, for example, that led to the development of this very novel export control package that was rolled out against Russia. And that was really the result, arguably, of the TTC process. So that's good news. So we're probably moving towards a more refined export control regime that will, over time, that will really look at the critical issues of sort of civilian dual-use technologies and how do we control those in ways that help to avoid supply chain disruptions. And then, of course, in the U.S., there are these structural issues around industrial policy. So who's going to manage some of these big problems, like administering the CHIPS Act funding? Commerce, I think in part of the bill will be an effort to set up an office in Commerce to do this. But these, again, are really long-term problems that have to have a lot of attention. So the CHIPS Act money, I think, runs to 2025 or 2026. What about funding after that? And what is the real measure there of in terms of reducing U.S. dependence on Taiwan, for example, by 2030? The industry did a study that showed that if you go to 2030 and you say, okay, if the U.S. wants to have 30% of its domestic needs met by domestic foundries for critical infrastructure and defense, then you would need, say, 5 or 6 advanced fabs, and you can work back and try to determine how do you get there. And probably, given some of the recent events with TSMC, of course, building a fab in Arizona, and Intel pledging to build 2 advanced fabs in Ohio, we're part of the way there. But again, those are complicated issues where companies have to make decisions about capex expenditures, and they want to make sure that this process is fair. There's a lot of issues around who should get CHIPS Act money, for example. Should foreign companies, or should Intel get funding? Intel has a big presence in China, for example, where it derives a lot of its revenue. So those kinds of debates are going to be tricky going forward because they've obviously become very politicized. But over the long term, the industry view in the semiconductor industry is a 10-year view out to 2030. And so this really needs sustained attention if the U.S. is going to make significant gains, for example, in reducing dependence on Taiwan for advanced semiconductor manufacturing. And then also, I think that my sense is that in the executive branch, which I advised over my career many times, again, there's some structural issues there. You have a very limited and small staff at the White House, for example, which is tackling these very complicated issues around supply chains. And again, the question is, if you're going to try to out-industrial policy China, then does that require a more careful rethink of how the U.S. government does industrial policy on a sustained basis over time? Because in particularly a complicated industry like semiconductors requires that close attention. So finally, I'll give you Paul's views on right-sizing the challenge. So semiconductors, I think, are really a tough issue. And I think that there's many pieces to that. We can tackle some of them in the Q&A. I think there's no doubt that Chinese firms, for example, are going to play a role in the semiconductor industry going forward. Already we have, for example, YMTC is producing 3D NAND memory that Apple is testing in its labs. It could be used in an iPhone down the road. And so China has moved very fast up the semiconductor value chain, for example. And the key question really for me is under what conditions will Chinese companies participate in the global supply chains? This gets back to the issue of subsidies. The Chinese government, of course, heavily subsidizes the industry, but I think there's not enough discussion about engaging China to reduce subsidies and to level the playing field, because I think, as Professor Scher noted, it really is all about reciprocity and leveling the playing field here. And I think the semiconductor industry is no exception. And it's a really tough issue. The one good example is for example, export controls related to SMIC, which is China's leading domestic foundry. I wrote a paper on this, which I think I put in the reading material. And my simple argument was trying to make an argument for allowing SMIC to obtain advanced EUV lithography equipment, because, as I noted in the paper, the national security gains of preventing SMIC from getting access to that equipment did not seem to be well articulated, whereas the advantages of having more capacity in the global semiconductor supply chain at advanced manufacturing nodes in China was measurable, and there were other ways to control the national security issues that were raised in terms of why the Chinese foundry was not allowed to use this advanced equipment. So I think that more discussion around those kinds of issues, I think, are really important. The other issue that I think is important is understanding, again, China, as Professor Scher has mentioned, it's a huge manufacturing economy. It's a $1 trillion manufacturing economy. And so the question there is, as people talk about decoupling, is how do you think about that in these very complicated sectors? So for example, we have clients that have facilities in China that are critical parts of their global supply chain. So they manufacture components in the US, they ship them to Shenzhen. Those are put into assemblies that are then sent to Thailand, that are then shipped back to China and to other markets to final end users. And to move a factory out of China, for example, would take 3 to 5 years to do that. And the question is, where would that be and how would they do that? So those kinds of issues, I think, are really critical as in the broader discussion about both decoupling and in sort of reshoring and onshoring and making supply chains resilient, is how do you actually do that in a way that doesn't disrupt the industries and companies involved in the industry. So let me stop there, because I raised a lot of issues, and happy to take questions in the Q&A.